Revisionist history, the practice of re-examining the established historical record, is in and of itself neither good nor bad. New findings can fundamentally alter the way we look at the past, but more often than not, we engage in historical revisionism because we interact with the established past through our own fluid lens of morality. The way we perceive history is distinctly different from how ancient scholars like Pliny the Elder viewed it. On the macro level, this means that historians from different eras thus have divergent opinions regarding the Italians' works. This can also occur on a micro level, with new events causing one to look at events differently than they had before. It also helps that society's so-called better half now have the right to hold the pen themselves. Returning to the past to document women's contributions to history is in it of itself an act of historical revisionism. Professor Phyllis Ratkin reveals to us that recent scholars have given us convincing evidence that past women were often stronger than we thought, in a poignant mediation on the fragility of women's history. Historian David Wallace reminds us that the lives of women have all too often been buried in oblivion, never ascending into privileged domain of a recorded life that could leave its mark in the future. In patriarchal societies, women were nearly always relegated to the sidelines, their accomplishments reduced to footnotes in the stories of their male co-stars. Matilda of England's immense accomplishments were reduced on her tombstone to, "Here lies the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry." Hatshepsut ruled Egypt efficiently, but had her name and image struck from the record by her co-ruling stepson. Joan of Arc was abandoned by the Dolphin, the man whom she'd seen crowned in vision and reality. Although I started this series in order to tell the feminist story of Queen Elizabeth I, it was this episode that excited me the most, one entirely focused upon the mother she hardly knew. I am myself often guilty of revisionism, digging deeper into stories of known historical women in an attempt to redeem them for the modern day audience. Those who teach in such a manner have students who know that Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." Rosa Parks was not just some tired woman who refused to move to the back of the bus because her feet hurt. And America's founding mothers did far more to advance the revolution than just sitting around sewing flags. As such, I expected that there'd be enough cracks in historical record to redeem Anne Boleyn, a woman whom history regards as a loose home-wrecking Jezebel. Her condemnation in life has continued to haunt her in death, as stories of her ghostly appearance continue to crisscross popular culture. Despite an intense effort to wrap my comforting arms around Queen Anne, I remained completely unsympathetic to her plight, even upon recognizing the fact that all women in the 16th century were abused, spiritually and mentally, from birth. In this episode, we'll examine Anne's quest to achieve her lofty goals during her short but eventful life. Her determination allowed her to succeed beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Her lack of foresight, however, prevented her from recognizing how many enemies she had made along the way. She had bet everything on her ability to produce a son for the king, but when the bills came due, she was compelled to pay with her head. It's harsh to call someone unredeemable, especially for a member of the Christian faith, which preaches to its adherents that no one is beyond salvation. There are historians who have attempted to see the best version of the Queen, and I'll include their voices in this episode. These men and women are doing some heavy lifting in their attempt to spin the Queen's actions, while completely ignoring her motivations. When the end came, Anne Boleyn met her fate with her head up, forgiving those who had condemned her to die, telling the assembled crowd, "I come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I pray God save the king, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I. Episode number 2, The Irredeemable, Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't the first Boleyn to capture King Henry VIII's fancy. That distinction belongs to Mary, Anne's oldest sister. Like her more famous sister, Mary was a social climber, attending Henry's sister in France upon her marriage to Louis XII. That relationship ended with a premature death of the king, just a few months after it began. Rather than returning with the rest of her ladies' court, Mary remained in France and is believed to have begun a brief but discreet affair with the new French monarch. Mistresses tend to fall out of favor quickly, however, and upon finding the label of damaged goods attached to her, she was forced to call her father's political favor in order to find her way back into England's court. Although Henry's sister didn't see fit in having Mary return to her service, the elder Boleyn daughter eventually found a place amongst the personal staff of Henry's wife, Katherine. Mary's affair with King Henry likely began in 1520, and it's widely believed that the 2 children she birthed into the world belonged to the English king. Incredibly, she had the audacity to name her children Henry and Katherine. Although he had done so for a prior mistress, Henry refused to acknowledge the births, declining to bestow the designation of king's bastard on either child. Despite this insult, Mary remained doted upon the king for 5 years, receiving numerous fine gifts and enchanted private dinners. Most royal marriages were pure business arrangements. It was with their mistresses that royalty found real happiness and companionship. Unfortunately, kings become used to the transactional relationships. While one must honor their wife unto death, it was quite easy to discard a royal mistress. It was upon witnessing how Mary was treated afterwards that led her little sister to devise a plan to ensure that she didn't have a similar fate. Thus, Anne maintained, despite all of Henry's lustful advances, that she would only sleep with him after he made her queen. The fact that she was in such a position to make demands of Henry is in and of itself quite remarkable, as Anne would be just the second commoner to be elevated to the consort's throne of England. Her family's political fortune rose with the arrival of the Tudors, who had replaced a large number of the entrenched aristocracy with successful merchants. Her father used his small fortune to build connections, which allowed him to embed his daughters within the high courts of nobility. Anne first served beneath the regent of the Netherlands before joining her sister, who was working on behalf of Mary Tudor in France. Ambition is important, but parents ought to nurture their children's inner ambition rather than using them to achieve their own goals. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, placed his girls in situations that he knew were dangerous. King Francis's court was well known as one of the most debauched. She, like her older sister, eventually caught the French king's attention, who compared her to the ancient goddess of love, declaring that they say Venus was blonde, but you can see well that she was a brunette. Historian Alison Weir reveals to us that Anne's charm lay not so much in her physical appearance as in her vivacious personality, her gracefulness, her quick wit, and other accomplishments. She was petite in stature and had a appealing fragility about her. Her eyes were black and her hair dark brown and of great length. But she was not pretty, nor did her looks conform to fashionable ideals of her time. She had small breasts when it was fashionable to have a voluptuous figure, and in a period when pale complexions were much admired, she was sallow, even swarthy, with small moles on her body. While her physical appearance didn't cause many heads to turn, she clearly held claim to sex appeal. Weir continues writing that Anne Boleyn was highly accomplished, intelligent, and witty. She loved gambling, played both cards and dice, and had a taste for wine, and enjoyed a joke. In other words, she was the type of girl that guys loved to hang out with, but would shy away from bringing her home to meet their family. Henry's wife, Queen Katherine, on the other hand, had grown up in the royal courts of Spain, a finishing school that is notoriously stringent in the upbringing of its princesses. Although Katherine had cherished the freedom that the English court offered, she remained reserved in comparison to the younger Anne. While Katherine remained the respected mother to the king's lone heir, she had suffered through 6 pregnancies over a period of 9 years. Time had been harsh with her, resulting in the Venetian ambassador harshly labeling her as ugly by 1515. Anne was part of Katherine's entourage when her sister Mary caught Henry's eye while dancing for the king in 1522. Their father capitalized upon the king's lust by earning a promotion to the position of treasurer of the royal household. We aren't quite sure as to when Anne caught the king's attention, but we know that he played a direct role in breaking up an engagement proposal that would have made her the Countess of Northumberland. Cardinal Wolsey was the man chosen for the task of informing the young couple that their proposal had been deemed unacceptable. Anne reacted with rage, an emotion that would become intimately associated with her. Weir details the future queen's thinking that the cardinal had ruined her life. The upstart butcher's son had dared to dismiss her as a hasty fellow, and had the effrontery to refer to her as a foolish girl. She left the court for a year, but upon her return in 1525, Henry again took great interest in her. Weir reveals that the king was interested by her grace and her sharp wit, while her sophistication and sexual allure were in delightful contrast to the Queen Katherine's piety and grave dignity. Anne was 24, Katherine approaching 40. In every way, she was in direct contrast to his aging wife. The king quickly made his approach, but was physically rebuffed by Anne, who proclaimed that she would rather lose her life than her honesty, which would be the greatest and best part of the dowry that she shall bring to her husband. From the very beginning of the courtship, Anne made it crystal clear that she wouldn't allow the king to round the bases until they were lawfully wed. For a king who had grown accustomed to women surrendering the instant that he beckoned, Anne's refusal was beyond captivating, and he quickly became obsessed. While I can applaud her decision to not engage in an affair, Anne wasn't living the life of a saint. Without informing Katherine, her alleged lady, she accepted the king's expensive gifts and cherished his private love letters. She also encouraged physical attention from him, but always stopped short of sex. It was all part of a carefully choreographed scheme to manipulate Henry. The king proposed to her by 1526, but only received a vague answer in return, forcing him to move forward in seeking an annulment without truly knowing if he had his next wife lined up already. Historian Anne Somerset notes that had the circumstances been less exceptional, Henry would have doubtless been content to have a brief affair with Anne and then discard her, as he had previously done with her sister. But Anne's initial refusal to become his mistress had happened to coincide with the king's growing awareness that he must remarry in order to beget legitimate male heirs. The history books make this next part of the story seem far quicker than it actually was. Henry decided that Katherine couldn't produce the male heir that he desperately sought, and promised that she could. Therefore, he divorced Katherine and married Anne. That is the gist of the story, but it occurred over a period of 7 long years, during which Anne continued to play hard to get. Despite her lack of a defined role, Anne began to immediately wield influence over Henry, using him to get back at her family's perceived enemies. Katherine was aware of the affair, but assumed that it would be like all of the others, a passionate distraction that would eventually flame out. Incredibly, Anne remained officially employed by the Queen after Katherine's request to fire her would-be replacement were steadfastly rejected by her husband. Others in the royal court were far more perceptive of what was truly happening behind the scenes, and thus began to enact their own plans to manipulate the king's urges for their own gain. Catholic reformers were immediately drawn towards Anne Boleyn. 10 years earlier, Martin Luther nailed his 95 problems with the church to the doors of his church in Wittenberg. The Catholic monk and theologian had some legitimate concerns, particularly after visiting the Vatican City and witnessing priests indulging prostitutes, rushing mass in a language their worshippers couldn't follow, and living lives of luxury while skimming money off their impoverished followers. As disgusting as they may be, these acts were just the tip of the iceberg, as the corruption of the 16th century church had long been on display for everyone to see. Pope Leo X dismissed all calls for reform, proclaiming that Martin Luther was some drunken German who will amend his ways when he sobers up. After a series of wars, Lutheranism established itself as the Protestant faith, one of dozens of new Christian churches that claims the ability to determine the true meanings of God's teachings. The Boleyns weren't Protestants, but they were reformists. She actively searched out forbidden literature in order to ensure that she had all the information available to her. Historian Alexandra Elise Deselmes notes that, having been exposed to reform ideas and works during her time in the French court, Anne brought these ideas back with her to England. She continued to import works, sometimes covertly. The trade in foreign religious books was technically illegal, but Anne used the status of the royal merchants to conceal books, and her brother smuggled works in his diplomatic bags. This knowledge further distinguishes Anne from Katherine, as the reformers' actions suggested she was at least curious about the religious reform, while the latter was the daughter of the man who established the Spanish Inquisition, an organization at the forefront of the war to ensure that Protestantism wouldn't spread to the Iberian Peninsula. For the moment, however, Anne was forced to play along with the church, as that venerable institution was viewed as the only avenue from which to annul Henry's marriage, an act that would clear the path for her own coronation. Desiring power, she put her long-term plans to the side and worked with Cardinal Wolsey, a man she despised among all others, knowing that she would eliminate him as soon as she had gotten what she wanted. Having manipulated Henry into proposing, she now faced the more difficult challenge of maintaining his attention. She did everything with him, except, of course, for the one thing the king desired above all. News soon leaked out that the English king was actively seeking to annul his marriage. The blame was heaped upon young Anne Boleyn. While she was working behind the scenes to draw Henry away from his wife, historian Alison Weir points out that she was merely a catalyst, and the indications are that Henry would have pursued an annulment at some stage anyway. For overriding all considerations was his desperate need for a male heir. It was during this period that the king's personality began its slow transformation from an affable man of the people to a brutal tyrant. Expecting a quick resolution, he was forced to wait for 7 long years to consummate his love for Anne. A number of personal correspondence between the two have been saved for historical record. In them, Henry pours out his heart for his sweetheart, regularly pining for them to have some time in private together. Some historians believe that she must have relented to the endless pressure campaign, but Weir notes that Anne's surrender was her trump card, and she would have been a fool to play it, with the future so uncertain and with the memory of her sister ever before her. Her letters back didn't drip with the same euphemisms. Although she clearly liked him, it is clear to see that she cared more for the crown of England than the man that would sit next to her. The king was still a strapping young athlete, but Anne had eyes for others, regularly flirting with the men of the court. She would later be accused of having affairs with a number of them. Again, something that most historians don't believe actually occurred. Likely, her flirtations were designed to inflame Henry's own desires for what she promised would one day be his to enjoy. Obsessed with constant thoughts of Anne, the king became desperate to find a way to wiggle out of his first marriage. The 16th century Catholic Church didn't make divorce easy. Henry attempted to keep Katherine unaware of his plans, but the looming split inevitably became the talk of Europe. The National Archives lists 8 reasons that were acceptable grounds for a divorce. 6 of them involved deceit in obtaining the marriage contract. Another was if your spouse committed adultery, which was the capital crime when it came to queens. And the last reason was impotence in the man. Henry genuinely cared for Katherine at this point in time. She had sacrificed her young in the attempt to provide him the heir that he desired. Mary, their daughter, remained beloved by both of them. Accusing Katherine of adultery in order to obtain the divorce he desired would have required Henry to also order her execution. Likewise, if he claimed that his own impotence as cause, the Pope would be unlikely to accept the divorce under the pretenses that Henry desired to sire a son with his next wife. Thus, Cardinal Wolsey was tasked with finding something that could count as deceit in regards to their engagement. His team quickly narrowed the options down to the fact that Katherine had previously been married to Henry's brother Arthur. Although civil and religious courts had agreed that the marriage had not been consummated, Henry had come to believe that God was actively preventing him from having a son due to the passage in Leviticus that forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife. The problem with this defense was that the couple had asked for a papal ruling prior to their nuptials. Beneath pressure from both England and Spain, the Vatican had sanctioned the marriage and was unlikely to reverse course. This was particularly true in 1527, after Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, had sacked Rome and taken the Pope prisoner. With rumors flying, Henry finally fessed up to his devoted wife, whose sobbing was so uncontrollable that Henry, a man who fashioned himself as the ideal chivalric knight, fled. Weir writes that after she pulled herself together, Katherine was able to assess her situation. She was alone and without counsel, far from her friends in Spain, with spies watching her every move. Yet she was the daughter of Isabella of Castile. Her principles were firm, her moral courage undoubted, and she believed her marriage was good and valid. Pope Julius had permitted it, and that was enough for her. She was the king's true wife, and the Princess Mary was his legitimate heir, and on these premises she would take her stand. She was convinced that both Wolsey and Anne Boleyn had led the king astray and planted doubts in his mind, and she saw it as her sacred duty to rectify the situation and persuade her husband that he was in error. Thus, the great matter, as Henry would refer to it, began. Anne continued to work behind the scenes to undermine Katherine, poisoning her actions in the mind of the king. Katherine gathered her allies in Spain and Austria-Hungary to pressure the Pope to slow roll any proceedings intended to cut her off from her rightful place in England, while Henry continued to do the impossible, keeping both his wife and girlfriend content while the process played out publicly. By 1528, every court in Europe was abuzz with rumors of what was happening in England. A large number of monarchs watched with bated breath, imagining that a victory for Henry might pave the path for their own divorces. Katherine was isolated during this period for fears that she might cause an uprising by eliciting Spanish support to bring her husband to heel. Perhaps even more dangerous, however, were any proclamations that she might make to the people of England. Sides were hastily drawn when it became known that Katherine was to be dismissed in favor of Anne Boleyn. Katherine found herself elevated by the people of London as a dignified mother, while Anne was openly declared as a whore and sorceress. Moreover, the king's decision ignored the truth behind what he argued in Rome, for the Tudors and the Boleyns had exactly the same degree of affinity. The semantics of it didn't matter, however, as long as Katherine's nephew held the Pope captive. Proving to all how serious he was about obtaining a divorce, Henry let it be known that he would be happy to go to war to free the Pope, if only His Grace first granted the king's request. As time went by, Wolsey revealed his own sense of desperation to deliver the king's annulment, telling his family that, if the Pope is not compliant, my own life will be shortened, and I dread to anticipate the consequences. Eventually, he and the papal negotiator came to a compromise, agreeing that if Katherine were to willingly go to a nunnery, Henry would be allowed to remarry in order to sire an heir. That plan, however, required the Queen to participate in her own downfall. For Katherine, that was a non-starter. When presented with the offer, she declared that she intended to live and die in the estate of the monarch to which God had called her. She found her living quarters, salary, and staff all reduced upon her refusal to withdraw from public life. She had suffered in a state of poverty during the run-up to her marriage to Henry, and was perfectly willing to once again tighten her belt. Weir notes that Henry was irritated by the way in which she seemed able to rise above her misery, and in October 1528, he complained to the Privy Council about her behavior. She was too merry, too richly dressed. She should be praying for a good end to her case rather than gracing courtly entertainments with her presence. Worst of all, by riding out and acknowledging the cheering of the crowds, she was enticing the king's subjects to rebellion. Locked in a zero-sum relationship, Anne rose in the wake of Katherine's fall. Rather than sympathizing with the queen for what she was going through, Anne twisted the knife at every opportunity, making sure Katherine knew exactly where she stood in her husband's heart. As early as 1529, Anne began performing duties that were normally reserved for anointed queens. She continued to push Henry towards Catholic reform, but her subtle nudges were lost in the king's rage for the Pope. As his views on the church reform grew more radical, Londoners found an easy scapegoat in Anne. Upon Cardinal Wolsey's advice, a trial came about in 1529 to resolve the situation. Katherine made a brief but defiant appearance, demanding that the court refer the matter to Rome. When her plea was dismissed, she was summoned once more to speak in her own defense. As she rose before the hushed courtroom, her message was unwavering and unmistakable, telling those assembled that, "I beseech you, for all the loves that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice and right. Where have I offended you? I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure. These 20 years and more, I have been your true wife, and by me ye have had children. Though it hath pleased God to call them out of this world, which hath been no fault in me, I take God to be my judge. I was a true maid, without touch of man, and whether it be true or not, I put it to your conscience." Her husband made no initial comment, merely sitting in the same room, staring vacantly past his pleading wife. After she left the hushed room, however, the king broke down, proclaiming that Katherine had been to him as true, as obedient, and as conformable a wife as I could in my fantasy wish or desire. "As God is my witness," he stated for the record, "no fault in Katherine moved me." Still, he urged the court to rule in his favor so he could be allowed to sire a legitimate male heir. The court stalled, days stretching into months as they hesitated, unwillingly, or perhaps afraid, to render a decision. When the court declared a 3-month recess, Henry's patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. Anne placed the blame for the failure squarely upon the cardinal, resulting in his dismissal from the court. Although Wolsey kept his head, he was forced to surrender vast estates to the king, who wasted no time in gifting them to his would-be queen, Anne Boleyn. But for Anne, this was not enough. Still seething over the humiliation brought about by the cardinal's trial, she pressed forward with 44 charges against the king's man, determined to see him executed. But when her attempt failed, a deeper fear took hold. Was she beginning to lose her grip on the king? Now 28 years old, Anne was growing older, and while Henry's desire for her remained strong, his obsession with having a son intensified. One couldn't help but wonder how much longer he would wait, with his bride-to-be approaching an age less suited for childbirth. But as one door closed, another often opened, and a new path emerged following Wolsey's dismissal. Thomas Cranmer, a clerk at Cambridge, believed the king's case ought to be judged by doctors of divinity within the universities rather than the papal courts. Such an action would allow Henry and Anne to bypass the Pope altogether. The king began his search for suitable professors right away, often tempting them with vast sums of treasure to secure their support for his divorce. He may not have realized it at the time. Henry VIII was now trotting the path of an authoritarian. Weir tells us that by November of 1529, Henry was as much in love with Anne Boleyn as ever, and still showered her with gifts, although these were now more in the way of a peace offering, for the relationship between them was by then often a stormy one. Anne felt that time was passing by her. She accused the king of having kept her waiting. Often she would threaten to leave Henry, and they quarreled violently. When the fight was made up, he placated Anne with yet more gifts. This charade was repeated on several occasions. As the months and then years went by, Anne became increasingly difficult to deal with. The constant strain of holding Henry at arm's length tested her endurance to the limit. Her position was insecure, and she knew it. Little things increasingly irked her, such as finding out that Henry still used his wife to mend his shirts. Upon finding this out, Anne exploded in rage and demanded that even more distance be put between the queen and her lawful husband. Mary, Henry's only legitimate child, sided with her mother and soon became collateral damage in the wake of the divorce. Anne Boleyn crossed the line here, and it's something that I have difficulty getting past, as children shouldn't have to bear the weight of their parents' troubles. By the age of 14, Mary, who retained her title as heir to the throne, knew exactly what Anne Boleyn's role was in the dissolution of her parents' marriage. She turned her father, who was increasingly acting as a despot. The Pope urged the king to come to Rome to face judgment, but Henry refused to be ordered around by a man whose authority he no longer respected. A break between England and Rome was becoming inevitable as the rift had formed between the king and his once beloved daughter. In 1530, Anne finally triumphed in her long-standing battle against Cardinal Wolsey. She had never been content to let him ride off into the sunset that year, and instead succeeded in having him declared a traitor. Anne Boleyn made no attempt in hiding her glee, throwing a party titled "The Going to Hell of Cardinal Wolsey" in celebration of his downfall. A Spanish ambassador loyal to Katherine wrote that the king's mistress is becoming more arrogant every day, using words and authority towards the king of which he has several times complained to the Duke of Norfolk, saying that she was not like the queen who never in her life used ill words to him. She wielded her newfound authority to rewrite her family's history, commissioning the College of Arms to fabricate a lineage tracing back to a 12th century Norman lord. England's citizens continued to rail against Anne, but Henry always rushed to her defense, banning publications that were insulting to his love and arresting troublemakers that continued to refer to her as the king's whore. On February 7, 1531, he took the unprecedented step of convening Parliament solely to elevate the king above the Pope. From henceforth, the pontiff became reduced in England to Peter's original title of the Bishop of Rome. Rather than a whole new institution, the Church of England remained Catholic in every way except for their leadership. 1 year after the change, a bishop who opposed it was nearly killed when white powder was found in his soup. It is believed that members of Anne's entourage were responsible for the act. A convenient scapegoat was quickly found, and Henry ordered the man to be boiled alive for the audacity of attempting to harm a member of the clergy. This was despite the fact that the king was himself publicly challenging the Pope to excommunicate him from the faith. Meanwhile, Henry continued to punish Katherine for her faithfulness to him. Were writes that in 1531, Henry was doing his best to provoke Katherine into giving him grounds for a divorce by deserting him. When Princess Mary fell seriously ill with a digestive disorder in March, Katherine, learning that her daughter had not kept any food down for 8 days, wanted to go to her. Henry, seeing his advantage, replied meaningfully that she might go and see the princess if she wanted, and also stop there. The implication was ominous, but Katherine guessed his purpose and refused to leave his side, even though she was desperate to see her child. Katherine's fight was for more than just her own vanity. If her marriage was annulled, Mary would legally become a bastard and subsequently deprived of her own inheritance. 6 months later, Katherine received a note to leave Windsor Castle within a month. Without a final goodbye, Henry left. They would never again stand face to face in the same room. Banished from the king's presence, Katherine wrote, "What I suffer is enough to kill 10 men, much more a shattered woman who has done no harm. I am the king's lawful wife, and while I live, I will say no other." Across England, women placed the blame squarely on Anne for Katherine's plight. In 1531, a mob of 7,000 marched on her house, intent on lynching her. The sheer scale of the uprising left the king powerless to intervene. Yet, despite the fury of the people, Henry remained enthralled by the one woman in England who refused to share his bed. He banished a friar who proclaimed that if the king made an unlawful marriage with the woman sitting next to him, he would be punished as God had punished Ahab, and the dogs would lick his blood. Anne traveled with him to view the southern counties, but the couple had to cut it short after angry crowds lined the roadsides in order to hurl abuse towards Katherine's usurper. One night, Anne returned to her chambers to find a chilling image, a depiction of her own beheading. Undeterred by the omen, Henry pressed forward, granting her family a noble title in 1532 to elevate her status. Shortly thereafter, the king issued a decree guaranteeing that any child conceived out of wedlock would be provided for if he died before marrying Anne. The implication was undeniable. Anne Boleyn had at last given in to him. Were writes that she took a final gamble, and it was this that promised her decision. The consummation of the relationship had only enhanced Henry's passion, and the Venetian ambassador was amazed at his great appetite for Anne. "The king cannot leave her for within an hour," wrote the Spanish ambassador, and it was true. Henry was more infatuated than ever, if that were possible. From this moment on, Anne carried herself as a queen, even demanding that Henry compel Katherine to surrender the queen's jewels to her. Yet, not everyone was so easily swayed. France refused to receive her on a diplomatic trip with Queen Eleanor, a relative of Katherine, making it clear that Anne ought to avoid the trip unless she wanted to be humiliated. Boleyn had won, but instead of handling her victory with grace, she took petty revenge on Katherine, including having her coat of arms deliberately defaced during the palace's redecorating. Around Christmas of 1533, she sealed her victory by revealing that she was pregnant. Within a week, Henry married her in a private ceremony. All 5 witnesses were sworn to secrecy, as the Vatican still considered Henry to be lawfully wed to another. Katherine was informed of the marriage 2 months later, with Henry sending 2 ministers to deliver the news to the woman he had recently testified was his true and obedient wife. Stripped of her title as queen, she was instead given the rank of Princess Dowager of Wales. Though Katherine's supporters urged Emperor Charles to declare war on England, the impending Turkish invasion of Central Europe hindered his ability to come to her aid. In April, Anne attended a public mass wearing the full regalia of the Queen of England, proudly adopting the motto, "Happiest of Women." The public backlash was swift and harsh, with congregations walking out of Mass when priests asked parishioners to pray for Queen Anne. Henry, quick to lose patience, grew increasingly frustrated with his people. Margaret Chancellor was the first to feel his wrath, imprisoned for shouting that Anne was a goggle-eyed whore. Obscene images and slogans began to circulate throughout the city. During Anne's official procession, only 10 people were heard calling out, "God save the Queen." She became the laughstock of London when it was revealed that the initials of the newlyweds, H and A, spelled out "ha ha" on official proclamations. Things quickly escalated. A woman known as the Nun of Kent was sent to the Tower for spreading a prophecy that the king and queen were doomed. Within a year, she and 5 accomplices were, according to drawn on hurdles to the gallows at Tyburn, and there hanged, cut down while still alive, and beheaded before great crowds. Theirs was the first blood spilt as the result of the great matter, and it would not be the last. Sir Thomas More, the royal advisor to Mary and Catherine's chaplain, found himself imprisoned in the Tower for refusing to accept Henry's change to the line of succession, based on his conviction that the king's first marriage was invalid. By 1535, the rivers ran red with blood as Henry, losing all patience for those who refused to accept his marriage to Anne Boleyn, executed 5 monks in a brutal fashion. Dragged through London's cobblestone streets by horse, they were hanged to the point of suffocation, revived with vinegar in order to be alert for their castration, disembowelment, and decapitation. More monks were sent to the gallows the next month for rejecting the king's supremacy. To keep the executions fresh, these men were chained upright to stakes, left to die without food or water, their bodies left to wallow in their own filth. As the days of their torment dragged on, the king and queen enjoyed lavish feasts at one of their summer estates. More executions followed, with writing that Henry was so pleased to see himself cutting off the heads of the clergy that he told Anne that he must have the performance repeated on the eve of St. Peter, a day formerly dedicated to honoring the Pope. While Sir Thomas More lost his head on the Tower Hill, Catherine's confessor was chained by his arms and waist above a slow-burning fire, destined to die a slow, agonizing death. Weir writes that Henry had done for Anne all he promised to do. He had married her and had her crowned with as much pomp as if she were a reigning monarch. It was now up to her to seal her part of the bargain by presenting him with the son which Henry, at 42 now, needed more desperately than ever, not only to ensure the succession, but also to justify the risks he had taken to marry Anne and break with Rome. The birth of a male heir would bring many waverers and dissidents over to his side. Already pregnant, Anne had every reason to feel secure in her new life, but rather than showing grace, she directed her venom at her stepdaughter. Mary was forbidden from contacting her mother and suffered further consequences when Anne's efforts at flattery failed to gain her stepdaughter's public endorsement as the true queen. In the final trimester of her pregnancy, Anne, once convinced she was untouchable and secure in the king's favor, was brutally reminded of the fragility of her position when Henry took on a new mistress. Weir notes that the wheel had come full circle. Not a year before, Anne had been the mistress and Henry the servant. 8 months of marriage had changed all that. Henry was now dominant, and he expected Anne, as his wife, to play the subservient role. Though after 7 years of having the upper hand, this did not come easily to her. Historian Michael Farquhar goes further, writing that, like Katherine before her, Anne was forced to put up with Henry's wandering eye. Unlike her predecessor, though, she was unable to contain her jealousy. She knew queens were disposable. After all, she was now sitting on another's throne. Far from being swayed towards monogamy by his wife's fits of fury, Henry became more adamant about enjoying himself in any way he desired. There was a time when Anne's passionate temper had served as an enticing prelude to sex. Now, it led only to bitterness and recriminations. The king told her angrily that she must shut her eyes and endure his affairs, as those who were better than she had done. Then he ominously reminded her that he could at any time lower her as much as he had raised her. Elizabeth was born into a fractured household in a kingdom split apart by turmoil. Though her arrival as a girl was met with disappointment, Henry temporarily embraced the man he had once been, whispering to Anne, "You and I are both young, and by God's grace, boys will follow." That hope, however, was never realized, as her first child would be the last to be born healthy. While the genetic trait was unknown at the time, modern scholars believe Anne was likely one of the rare individuals with rhesus-negative blood. Women with this marker can carry a healthy pregnancy, but somewhere during or after the first, a substance known as agglutinogen forms in the bloodstream, attacking and destroying rhesus-positive red blood cells in any subsequent fetus. In other words, her own body may have turned against her. Elizabeth was baptized, paraded through the city, and placed ahead of Mary in the official line of succession. Against Anne's wishes, she was handed over to a wet nurse and sent away to be raised by others at only 3 months old. To further add to the humiliations Princess Mary had already endured, she was forcibly made to serve her infant half-sister against her will. Anne, like Katherine before her, found herself pregnant again soon after Elizabeth was born. Henry took no chances, even telling his ministers to keep Mass under an hour and a half, for Anne tires easily. It was during this pregnancy that the Pope officially excommunicated Henry VIII. In the aftermath of the proclamation, Henry and Anne went on a crusade against the Catholic holdouts living in England. For the Queen, it was a chance to enhance the program of reform which he had subtly pushed Henry towards. For the King, it was a way to seize profitable church lands and restore the royal treasury, which was facing a severe decline. Some of the seizures were legitimate, such as the Abbey of Gloucestershire, which had been charging pilgrims excessive fees to pray in front of their phial, of which they proclaimed to be Jesus' holy blood. Upon seizure, testing, and torture, however, it was proven to merely be the blood of a duck, which had been regularly renewed in order to keep the scam going. Anne urged Henry to have Katherine put to death under the Act of Succession, which made it a capital crime to refuse to admit that Elizabeth was the lawful heir to the throne of England. Although Henry considered it, he never pulled the trigger. Choosing a coward's path, he sent Katherine to a royal household known for its unhealthy conditions, where she would spend her final years struggling with early stages of cancer while mourning the loss of her husband. In July 1534, Anne gave birth to a stillborn daughter. The emotional and physical toll of the successive pregnancies and the heartbreak of her loss aged her visibly. Rather than draw Henry closer, her struggles only distanced him, as he sought solace in younger lovers. Weir reveals that Henry had finally realized that marrying Anne had been a mistake. No longer did he see her through a lover's eyes. After 2 years of marriage, he was well able to regard her objectively and could see little to impress him. Her arrogance, vanity, and hauteur all proclaimed her inadequacy as a queen, and her public displays of emotion and temper were embarrassing. She had succeeded in making enemies of those who might have been her friends, and had displayed an unbecoming eagerness to wreak vengeance upon her enemies. She had probably lied about her virginity, and worst of all, she had failed as yet to produce a son. Anne's only hope of reclaiming her lofty position in Henry's heart rested on bearing him a male heir. As anxiety over her future mounted, she turned to manipulation, claiming to Henry that God had sent her a vision, one that made it clear she could not conceive a son as long as Katherine and Mary were alive. Her third pregnancy ended 6 months in. Henry was ready to be done with her, and she sought comfort in spending time with her 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth. Henry took solace in the arms of a 27-year-old Jane Seymour, a virgin who hailed from an influential noble family. The years were beginning to take a toll on the king, particularly after a riding accident limited the physical activity he could participate in. Jane had witnessed Katherine's fall from grace and Anne Boleyn's rise firsthand. Taking a page from Anne's book, she too resisted the king's advances. While most noble women were married by the age of 15, Seymour vowed to remain chaste until she was legally wed. Over time, members of the Seymour family maneuvered into influential court positions, yet another noble family willing to exploit their daughter for a higher station. As her enemies closed in, Anne became convinced that her entire future depended on the outcome of her 4th pregnancy. Around this time, the Spanish ambassador subtly revealed to the royal courts of Europe that he was certain that Anne had plans to poison Katherine. Wurr shares some insights into the Queen's thought process at the time, noting that Anne believed, mistakenly as it turned out, that while Katherine lived, her own life was in danger. "She is my death and I am hers," she said at this time, "so I will take good care that she shall not laugh at me after my death." It was a supreme irony that Katherine's existence was later shown to have guaranteed Anne's safety, rather than having threatened it. For while Katherine lived, Henry dared not set Anne aside. He had already set a precedent which had resulted in his excommunication. With each new insult to the sacrament of marriage, the prospect of Europe uniting against him grew, potentially igniting a movement that would send their armies to confront heretics who now ruled England. Poison proved unnecessary, as Katherine succumbed to cancer on December 1st, 1535. She never lost the love of her daughter or the people of England. Incredibly, she still harbored affection for the man who had made her last decade on earth a living hell. Her final dictated letter was addressed to "My lord and dear husband," and it proclaimed that "the tender love I owe you forced me with a few words to put you in remembrance of health and safeguard of your soul. I do pardon you." The autopsy showed a black growth on the Queen's heart, leading to suspicions of poisoning. Without the benefit of modern medical knowledge, Henry quietly questioned whether his new wife had orchestrated the death of her predecessor. Meanwhile, Anne's joy was unrestrained as she proclaimed triumphantly, "Now I am indeed a queen." For those in the kingdom who have never accepted her marriage as valid, Henry was now a widower, free to marry again according to the Catholic law. The whole country waited anxiously, hoping that a pregnancy would result in a healthy boy. The event that would ultimately seal Anne's fate occurred on the day of Katherine's funeral, ensuring the late queen would have her last laugh. Henry spared no expense on Katherine's funeral, commissioning an elaborate memorial in her honor. Yet, in the afternoon, Anne Boleyn entered the king's chamber to find him with Jane on his knee. Enraged, Anne erupted into a frenzy that Henry, frantic with concern for their unborn child, could not quell. The damage was done, and Anne suffered a miscarriage. Doctors, though uncertain due to the early stage of the pregnancy, believed the child would have been a son. Anne, devastated by the loss of her final hope, lashed out at Henry, accusing him and Jane Seymour for her misfortune. Henry's response was curt. "I will speak with you when you are well." With that, he shut the door on both his broken wife and their faltering marriage. Fuming with rage, the king expressed to his friends that he had been seduced into this marriage by Anne's witchcraft, and therefore he deemed it null and void, pointing to the fact that God had not allowed them to have a male heir, and that he believed he might take another wife. It was the crack that Katherine's supporters and Anne's detractors needed. They swarmed in for the kill. Anne, dreading the same fate as Katherine, divorced and cast out from court, was unaware that Henry had already consulted his top advisor, the morally dubious Thomas Cromwell, to look into the rumors circulating about her. He was happy to assist. Although the two had been allies while scheming to secure the annulment for Henry's first marriage, historian Eleanor Herman reveals that by 1535, they disagreed on several important policies regarding religious reform and foreign alliances. On one occasion, Anne, losing her temper, even threatened Cromwell to his face to have him beheaded. Weir reveals that Cromwell's intention was to accuse Anne of a capital crime, such as high treason, and institute proceedings against her. The crime must be such as it to inspire not only revulsion for Anne, but also sympathy for Henry, and it must be something that would merit divorce as well as death. Given Anne's love for flirtation and her encouragement of the fashionable cult of courtly love, few would find it hard to believe that, desperate for a child, she had resorted to adultery, even to plotting the death of the king in order to save her own skin. Henry's willingness to accept the trumped-up charges was shocking, as it would mean admitting that he'd been cuckolded by a woman whom he had risked his soul. Yet, he was ready to move on to Jane Seymour, a more docile choice. The legal process moved quickly, with 5 men, 4 nobles, and 1 court musician rounded up, tortured, and put before the magistrates hand-picked by Cromwell. Despite the brutality inflicted upon them, only the musician confessed to having entered the Queen's chambers at night. His testimony later would be used by the Catholic supporters of Mary to question Elizabeth's legitimacy. Jane, though not involved with the proceedings, stayed silent, content to continue manipulating the king from the shadows. Her loyalty was with Katherine, meaning that she eagerly awaited Boleyn's downfall. Within a week, Anne Boleyn was conveyed to the Tower of London. The extent to which her standing had diminished in her husband's eyes became clear as she endured a public humiliation akin to a medieval perp walk as she was conveyed via a barge down the Thames River at midday. Despite the crowds that gathered to gloat at her misery, she kept a serene exterior, only showing vulnerability once she had passed through the court gate of the Tower. Fully aware that the pile of evidence against her was fabricated, Cromwell's spies meticulously documented every word muttered by the despondent woman, hoping to catch her in self-incrimination. Their notes reveal a woman on the edge, mentally unraveling. This is not an indictment of Anne, for she was facing charges that would lead to her execution, all while grappling with the emotional toil of 3 failed pregnancies and the relentless cruelty of those who continued to mock her as a goggle-eyed whore. Throughout her confinement, Anne was caught in an emotional whirlwind, switching abruptly between fits of crying to laughing, as though unable to control the thoughts spiraling through her mind. Farquhar points out that the manic transitions from tears to laughter, along with episodes of incoherent rambling, prompted no doubt by overwhelming stress and fear, characterized her stay in the Tower. She had every reason to be frightened. Cromwell, with the king's obvious complicity, was arranging a trial that would make certain the poisoning whore, as Henry now referred to her, would never come out alive. There were no public uprisings in her favor, as the people of London found the charges wholly believable. Nor was there any chance that Henry would extend leniency towards her. Katherine's decade in exile had been a thorn in his side that permeated as a black cloud that hung above his reign. Although Anne had nowhere near the popularity of her predecessor, Henry wasn't willing to keep her around as rallying point for a few Protestants, which had embraced her as their queen. Any lingering doubt about her fate would have vanished the moment Anne discovered that her husband had already begun planning his wedding to Jane Seymour. Even if you somehow didn't know this story beforehand, you can surely anticipate where it is going by this point. At the top of the episode, I told you that I thought Anne Boleyn was utterly unredeemable. I also told you we would hear from some of those who disagree with that sentiment. Both Were and fellow historian Eleanor Herman pointed out that the Queen was known for charitable giving, involving herself personally in determining the worthiness of the recipients which she helped. Anne's harsh demeanor can largely be explained by the weight of public perception, which had already been set before she could ever truly present herself. Though Henry would later face widespread condemnation, the English people readily blamed Anne for any action of his that they deemed objectionable. He escaped criticism, while she shouldered the blame. Herman writes that most historians agree that Anne's crime was not adultery, but ambition. It is perhaps not unexpected that the self-made men at Henry's court, the butcher's son, Thomas Wolsey, and the brewer's son, Thomas Cromwell, have never been accused of overwhelming ambition. They have usually been admired for their hard work, intelligence, and cunning to rise so high. Wolsey was incredibly greedy, with numerous luxurious palaces, and had a mistress even though he was a cardinal. And to do the king's bidding, Cromwell crafted edicts that ended up killing thousands of people. But never mind that. Boys always get a pass. Both men are seen as efficient public servants. When a woman, however, uses intelligence, charm, and hard work to prove her lot, she is accused of a crime of ambition, of scheming, and playing the slut to sate her greed and selfishness. Anne Boleyn stood at the fatal crossroads of religious upheaval, political power plays, a sociopathic husband, and misogyny. In a trial that lasted mere hours, 4 men, including the Queen's own brother, accused of incest, were convicted of adultery with Anne Boleyn. Their sentence was merciless: drawn, hanged, castrated, and quartered. 2 days later, Queen Anne Boleyn was brought before the same 26 magistrates. Weir writes that her face betrayed no emotion, even when another charge was added, that of having poisoned the late Queen Katherine and attempting to do the same to the Lady Mary. Instead, she listened patiently, then answered clearly to each charge, refuting them all firmly and arguing her case with such clarity and good sense that her innocence, which she protested vehemently, seemed manifest. to many of those watching her. Nevertheless, when the 26 peers were asked to give their judgment upon the Queen, every one pronounced her guilty. Her own uncle was among those chosen to condemn her. He at least wept as he pronounced a sentence of death. She responded to the court by proclaiming that God hath taught me how to die, and he will strengthen my faith. As for my brother and those who are unjustly condemned, I would willingly suffer many deaths to deliver them. But since I see it pleased the king, I shall willingly accompany them in death, with this assurance, that I shall lead an endless life with them in peace. With her fate sealed, the Tower grounds closed in around her. Confined to what would become known as the Queen's house, she could do nothing but gaze out at the execution grounds, where death awaited. The trial had deliberately left the method of her execution ambiguous, a bargaining chip for the king's agents as they sought to persuade Anne to consent to an annulment. We aren't privy to the conversation between her and the archbishop as he administered the Holy Sacrament to her, but she came out of the meeting proclaiming to her maids that she was to be banished, perhaps to a nunnery. Alas, it wasn't to be. The king had ordered her decapitation to be held on May 17, 1536. Fate granted Anne a short reprieve. The king's hand-picked executioner had delayed making his way to the capital. Henry believed it was a kindness to call forth the supposed best of the best in this gruesome field. Displaying gallows humor, Anne responded to the delay by stating that she had thought to be dead before this time and past my pain, but that it was good for the king to have sent for the best, as she had heard said executioner was very good, and that she had a little neck. She languished for another 24 hours as the king's executioner faced yet another delay. Meanwhile, Henry remained unfazed, indulging in extravagant celebrations with Jane Seymour. The Spanish ambassador noted that the king was out to dinner here and there and everywhere with the ladies, returning along the river after midnight to the sound of music and singing. Her execution commenced at 9 a.m. on May 19th, as she arrived at the Tower ground escorted by a small contingent of the famed Beef-Eater Guards. Weir describes the prisoner as wearing a robe of dark gray or black damask trimmed with fur, with a low square neck and a crimson kirtle. From her shoulders flowed a long white cape. She looked exhausted and dazed, which was aptly the result of 2 sleepless nights and partly from apprehension. She also kept looking behind her, as if she expected at any moment to see the king's messenger coming galloping into the Tower to bring word of a reprieve. If so, it was a vain hope. She made her way up to the scaffold, her foot brushing the executioner's. With a whispered apology, she slipped him a purse of 20 pounds. One last attempt at control in a world that had long since stripped it from her. A well-paid headsman meant a clean death. Botched executions were not unheard of, as she had no wish to become another gruesome example. The difference between mercy and horror laid in the precision of his stroke. Anne made a final statement, speaking of Henry, who had deliberately stayed away, as one of the best princes in the world, a man who had always been good to her. She then proceeded to lay her head upon the block, removing her hood, placing her flowing hair to the side, and unclasping her necklaces in order to give the executioner a clear path to his objective. She was repeating a prayer when the axe fell, As the executioner lifted her head to show the assembled crowd, it was remarked that the Queen's lips continued to move in prayer for a few moments, even after her death. Elizabeth was only 2 years and 8 months when her mother was executed. Had she been born a boy, it's likely that everything would have unfolded differently. Before Anne's body had even been laid to rest, palace workers were already frantically at work, erasing her initials and replacing them with Jane Seymour's. As I mentioned earlier, Jane had stayed true to Katherine. She had also remained steadfast in her devotion to the Catholic Church. While part of her courtship with the king was driven by her family's ambitions, Jane also believed she could restore Mary's position at court, either beneath her own future sons or possibly as queen herself. Elizabeth, merely a toddler at this point, thus found herself surrounded by enemies. Her only protection lay in a father who had deluded himself into believing that the girl's mother had cheated upon him with literally hundreds of guys. Once a chivalric knight, the king had, over the course of 20 years in pursuit of a son, become a tyrant, willing to humiliate, exile, and execute even his own family members. In our next episode, we'll dive into how growing up in an unforgiving world played a pivotal role in shaping the woman she would become. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting Empires Pod on Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.